What is up, guys? It is Nofsky with Academia Audio, and I'm going to show you how to take your song from this
Take my hand,
to this.
take my hand. Won't you show me that it's real? Take my hand.
What's that, Josh? What does this video entail? Well, I am really glad you asked because I actually made a whole series, 5 8-minute videos on how to mix your song start to finish. All jokes aside, I remember back when I was a beginner producer and I was just searching YouTube just to kind of figure out, how do I mix my song? How do I gain stage? How do I post-process? All those questions that I had, and I would come across these videos and they'd be like, how to mix your song, and I'd watch it and they'd have a starting, this is where I took it from all the way to here, and I would follow all their steps, and I got to the end and my song sounded absolutely nothing like their song. And so I wanted to create a whole video, just start to finish, where I'm not skipping any steps, I'm not doing anything. If I move my mouse or if I go back to a sound that I thought I already had dialed in, you guys are gonna see it. So you guys can end up with a professional quality sounding mix at the end with no magic tricks, no BS or anything. So without any further ado, let's jump in. Alright guys, so let's go ahead and jump into mixing this track and getting it to sound good and come alive. So all I've done on this track is the creative process so far. So just adding plugins like Endless Smile and some delay and a little bit of reverb and maybe some automation with some filters and things like that. But as far as mixing goes, I have not touched this track. Everything is at 0. Before we actually dive in and start turning knobs and adding plugins, the first thing that I like to do is kind of like a prep mix, kind of like a pre-mix routine. And I usually do this at the start of my track, but I wanted to make this as realistic as possible for producers that are at this phase of everything's just kind of everywhere and it's a little overwhelming and they don't know what to do. So first thing, I already did the decency of color coding everything because we are going to bus things. It's so important in the mixing phase to be organized. Everything has a place. Things are grouped together. So that's the first thing we're going to do. Everything in red is going to be the bass bus. So we're going to label this bass bus. Everything in this pinkish color is going to be the synth bus. Everything in blue will be the drum bus. Effects for green, and this other pink color will be vocal. So now that's a little less intimidating. We kind of have sections that we're going to go about this. The second thing I like to do is, if anything isn't labeled, go ahead and label it. So you'll notice I have most things labeled here, sub, mid, reverse bass, short reverse. This one actually says Nofsky respace, kick, top kick, snare, clap, hi-hat, shaker, the list goes on. I don't have some things labeled in here, so I'm going to go ahead and do that really quick. Alright, so everything is labeled. We can kind of wrap our minds around this project a little easier. So after everything is labeled and grouped together, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set up a side chain really quick. I'm going to create a new audio track. I like to put it right above my kick. We're going to label this SC for sidechain. I'm going to give it a black color. I'm going to go ahead and grab my kick. That should be good. Let's change that color. And this is called a sidechain trigger. So everywhere I have a kick, I'll be placing one of these, just like that. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my sidechain plugin. And I already know I'm going to sidechain the bass, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to grab Pro C, and I already have a sidechain setting right there. I'm going to go ahead and do the input as sidechain, and now you'll be able to hear the bass bus groove a little better now, compared to if I turn that off. So massive difference. Always sidechain your tracks. You don't want the sub of the kick competing with the sub bass. So it's really important to do that, and it also creates a really nice effect. So let's go ahead and start with the drums here, and we're just going to take this one by one and go through the whole track. So when starting a mix down, I always like to establish an anchor point, and 99.9% of the time that anchor point is the kick. The kick is going to be the loudest element in the track. So let's go ahead and give the kick a listen. So it's pretty good right out the gate. I am going to EQ just a few things really quick. So how I typically EQ my kicks is I'll go ahead and cut everything below 30. I'll then have a little dip around the 500 frequency range because there's usually a little bit of a pop or a click there. And then I'll also roll off some of the highs as well. So something like that. Let's go ahead and give this a listen. Before, after. The other thing I'm doing in this track is I also have a top kick, and it's okay to have top kicks. A lot of times you don't need them, but for this I was going for a very specific style. And so how we're going to go about that is we have two kicks here essentially. This is what the top kick sounds like. So you might not think that that has a lot of low end in it, but we just want to eliminate any possibility. So let's go ahead and visualize it really quick and kind of see what's going on here. I'll make this bigger. So you see all that rumble right there? That is going to muddy up our mix when it's hitting at the same time as the kick. So we're going to want to eliminate that. So I'm going to go ahead and cut a lot of that, and I'm also going to trim the fat from the top because, again, this is just an accent piece. So what I'm doing here is strategically using an EQ to accent my kick drum to give it a unique texture. So let's listen to this. Now let's go ahead and listen to them together. So this is before the EQ. This is after. So now I don't have to worry about any sub frequencies competing here, and it's just a nice little topper on that kick. So back to anchoring your kick. If our kick is at 0 dB, then we need to dial in the rest of our drums. So a rule of thumb that I follow with that is usually my snare and clap is going to be around -3 dB quieter, but again, it's really important to have a reference track so you can go ahead and reference how loud the other person's clap or snare is in the track that you're wanting to sound like, if that makes sense. So let's go ahead and listen to the drums together. Let's just do the kick and snare and clap. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and group my snare and clap, and I'm going to call this the snare bus. And that way I can process them together. If I want to add any reverb, I can go ahead and do it to them both and kind of make any EQ cuts, which is something I'm going to do right out the gate. Now, you don't always have to do this with snares, but if your snare is hitting at the same time as your kick right here, then it's really important to do this. So let's go ahead and give this a listen and dial this in. So I'm thinking right there sounds good. Now I am going to automatically turn this snare bus down -3 dBs. Now let's give the drums a listen. So that sounded a lot better. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of give the snare and the clap its own space. So I'm going to go ahead and shift the snare stereo image to the right and the clap just a little to the left. So they kind of are separated from one another, not hitting right on top of each other. And I also did that visually here, so you can see this is off the grid just a little bit, just to kind of give it a more realistic flow, and it's also not going to peak at that point. So another thing with the snare clap combination, when I was actually reaching for samples to use, I did have that end goal in mind. So when I chose this snare, I chose something that was kind of bulky in the body. This is what it sounds like. And then when I chose the clap, I chose something that was more kind of registering on the top end. So together they make a really nice, full, unique sound. Here's the clap. And together. So I'm choosing samples that complement each other and not conflict, if that makes sense. So let's go ahead and move on to the hi-hat and shaker. And I'm going to go ahead and also group these guys together, and we'll call this cymbal bus. I'm going to turn these on, and let's give this a listen. So the way I dial in this is I'm going to go ahead and drag an EQ on the drum bus just so I can kind of analyze and see dB wise where everything is hitting. Now let's give this a listen. So kind of rule of thumb, you have your dBs here, and so I kind of want this snare and clap to be hitting around this line. I want my kick to be at 0, and then I also want my cymbals and hi-hat to kind of hit at the 0 line as well. So let's go ahead and dial that in really quick. So I'm going to turn my snare bus down 2 more dB. And then let's go ahead and turn the cymbal bus down like 5 or something. And then I am going to turn this top kick down just like 2. So that's looking pretty good. The other thing to keep in mind is you might get it perfect the first time, you might not. The amount of times I end up going back and tweaking some things as I add in other elements happens quite often. So that is a very real thing, and don't be bummed out if you start to work on the bass and then you go back to the drums and you're like, oh, I need to dial this in a little more. It's all about dialing it in. There's not one size fits all. So as far as gain, staging, and EQing on the individual tracks, I think we're done. Let's go ahead and do a group bus process. So when going about processing drums, I like to add a little bit of saturation. So I'm just going to choose this preset saturate in color, and I'm going to give it a little bit of drive. The next thing I like to do is add a compressor just so it kind of keeps those peaks down a little bit and glues everything together a little bit. So what I'm looking for is the drums to be hitting around this 3 dB right here. So I'm going to crank this threshold down until we see that. So that sounded pretty good. And again, when we use a compressor, we don't want to add volume or take away volume. We just want the effect of the compressor. So let's go ahead and add back that dB right here. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to hit tab, and I'm going to look at the master, turn off this compressor, and let's see where we're hitting before we added the compressor. About 922. I'm going to turn on the compressor and let's see where we're at. So we lost about 2.5 dB, so I'm just going to add that back right here on the gain knob, and let's check that again. Perfect, 9.5, close enough. The last thing I like to do is go ahead and add some parallel compression. And I don't want to make this a tutorial about parallel compression, but I do want to just briefly explain the concept. So you have a send track over here, and what this does is it takes the signal from the drum bus, it sends it through this send track to whatever plugin you have. I happen to have a compressor that is just compressing the ever-living life out of that signal, and then it's going to mix it back in with the original signal. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to do that by turning this guy right here. And that, my friends, right there is how you're going to get a nice hit you in the chest drums. So I'm going to go ahead and disable this really quick so you guys can hear the difference. This is without. And this is with. Perfect. And that pretty much wraps up the drum bus for now. Let's go ahead and give it a listen in the mix really quick. So it's sounding all right. We now have to anchor the rest of the instruments and elements around that kick. All right, guys, that pretty much wraps up the video. I hope you learned a lot today. Also, stay tuned. The next video will be diving into the bass bus, which is actually one of my favorite parts, so you do not want to miss that. Also, keep in mind, we do have a free template down below that does like 60 to 80% of this for you. All the little EQ cuts and side chains and buses and things that I'm setting up, it's already set up for you. It's free. It's down below. It'll take you 30 seconds. Just go ahead and download that, and I promise it will help you so much in your music making career. Also, guys, if you have any questions or comments, or you want to add anything to the video or just roast me, feel free to do that down below. I love to see those. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps the growth of the channel. You guys have a blessed day. Peace.